We are joined with the man himself, Warwick Powell. How you doing, Warwick? You doing okay today?
I'm okay. I'm just making a little adjustment to the tie and all good.
I,
How are you?
I have to do that myself, by the way. I be watching myself in the mirror doing one of these numbers. No, man, I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you for joining me. It's late there, and I always
That's
feel
okay.
bad that it's so late in Australia. I mean, God, man, when Jeff comes on, it's gonna be like 11 o'clock for Jeff. I mean, he's like an hour even further
Yeah.
behind. But Warwick is an adjunct. Warwick Powell, he's an adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Network Group of Companies, and president of Data Integrity and Supply Chains Association, Inc. Warwick, you are the person I want to talk to today. And it's for something that's not necessarily related to Australia, but it is related to the economy in the US. You wrote an article, and the article fits firmly with, I guess, the point of view that I was espousing here over the government shutdown and Democrats' capitulation over the ACA subsidies. So I'm not sure if you were paying attention entirely to what's taking place in the US, but there's a government shutdown that was in effect. The government shutdown was in effect for like 40 days, give or take. Um, the fight primarily was over the Affordable Care Act, ironically named, subsidies that were going to effectively balloon to 2 and 3 times the amount that people were typically paying. I had a conversation with my mom yesterday. Medicare apparently went up 3 times. Couldn't believe it. Meaning what she was paying before, she is now paying 3 times more than what she was paying before for Medicare, government healthcare. Obamacare subsidies are going to go up 2 and 3 times more than what they currently are, meaning people are going to get fleeced because healthcare in America is extraordinarily expensive. And you wrote this article, Post-Liberalism Funhouse Mirror. You said the alt-right hollow case, cultural catharsis in the ruins of capital. And the argument that you effectively make is that the Republicans are as woke as Democrats. And I'm using the terminology in that sense. I don't think you used it in an article, but I'm using the terminology. That they use culture war every bit as much as Democrats use cultural war or identity. Meaning Democrats often would say, hey, we need to focus on people's identity, their pronouns. We need to ensure that we talk about people carved up as black, white, gay, straight, hermaphrodite, etc. And that's the way we need to do our politics. And if we focus on issues of identity, we can ignore issues of economics and anything that deals with the actual issues that affect all of these people, which is their wallet, how much they pay for their kids, how much they pay for their house. We can do a bait and switch of sorts. Well, Republicans, as you point out in this article, are effectively doing the exact same thing. We're going to have these culture wars. Muslims are killing Christians. We need to go after immigrants. We need to do all of these things. And yet, as you look around them, this does nothing for the fact that their healthcare has gone up 4 times. It does nothing for the fact that the amount that they pay for housing has gone up just tremendously. I saw the graph that like spiked, like literally almost a vertical line. I think the average homeowner at this point, I heard somewhere, was 38 years old, meaning the overwhelming majority of people don't have a house, won't get a house, and that's just on average. And you can go down the list of item by item by item by item on these things that affect how people live in society, where both political parties seems to use issues of identity or cultural war tokeneering in lieu of economic development, things that would affect their wallet, things would affect their quality of life. Give me your take on this. And just as a brief synopsis of the article itself, I'm going to show it to the audience and I'll put it at the bottom of the video. Right here. Post-liberalism's funhouse mirror, the alt-right's hollow core, cultural catharsis in the ruins of capital. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, it's good to be with you again, Jamal. Look, I've been thinking about this for a long time because clearly over the last 3 to 4, 5 decades or so, there has been a progressive a reduction in the quality of life for a growing number of people in many Western societies, to varying degrees. But certainly the United States, we've seen, I think, a situation where the real wages of about 50% of the workforce or 50% of households have not increased for the best part of half a century. The middle class is shrinking. Some of that is going into, I guess, what you'd call the upper middle class, but a large proportion of that is falling down as well. So the American dream, which is an expanding middle class, has really not materialized. The promises of the neoliberal revolution from the 1980s onwards really haven't delivered the goods. And in recent times, a particular political movement, I guess, is what I broadly call the alt-right, has emerged, which has really, I guess, tapped into this vein of growing discontent. But it's tapped into it in large part by mobilizing and antagonizing what are, in effect, cultural grievances. It works on symbols of cultural and social identity, often racialized, not always, but in some cases it is, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. And it really seeks to harness an anger within the body politic to, in a sense, turf out those that are held responsible for the situation that people find themselves in. But the paradox of all of this is that those who have managed to identify these veins of grievance and tap into them and exploit them actually profit from the persistence of grievance and complaint and anger rather than from the resolution of the conditions that give rise to all of this anger in the first place. None of the responses from the alt-right include a meaningful economic program. There's plenty to say about what should happen in schools and various forms of social policy and immigration and those sorts of things, but there's actually very little said meaningfully about the causes of the economic conditions and therefore the remedies that are needed. And all you get are slogans, we'll tariff this and we'll tariff that. But none of that is actually having a material impact. Despite the rhetoric, it's costing working families more today than things cost 6 months and 12 months ago. And it's demonstrably not improving the quality of life. The housing crisis is a classic example where the response is to introduce 50-year mortgages. The fact that more and more Americans are now delinquent on motor vehicle loans is not giving rise to a serious thought process around how to make transport more affordable, including cheaper cars, but in fact we'll now have 15-year loans instead. So the economic structures that actually gave rise to all of this malcontent, understandable malcontent, are actually being reinforced and amplified at the same time as a war being waged against this sort of cultural discontent. And so from where I sit, I think that the alt-right is in large part nothing more than the mirror reflection of the woke left that it so despises.
Yeah, agree. 1,000% agree. When I read the article, that was the sentiment that I got out of the article. Effectively, for all of this talk about we need to stop transgender surgeries, we need to get rid of, I think they even got rid of the slavery thing in DC, the slavery museum in DC. We need to get rid of woke studies and for all of this stuff. But the reality of it is Donald Trump got in with this idea that, hey, I'm going to improve the economy. I'm going to put money in your pocket. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And instead, predictably, he passes the quote unquote, ironically named also, big, beautiful bill that is effectively a transfer of wealth to the 1%. And as you point out, doing 50-year mortgages doesn't really solve that issue. In fact, you can make an argument that it almost bastardizes the issue. It's effectively saying, hey, I'm not going to put more money in your pocket. Don't expect me to put more money in your pocket. So I'll extend the time frame that you could have a mortgage so you could pay less on it over a longer time period. It's like, okay, well, thank you. That's almost an admittance that nothing is going to fundamentally change in your basic affairs, in the way that you effectively operate in the world and the money that you have in your pocket in regards to that operation. At least that's the way I took the 50-year mortgage.
Yeah, it's actually going to make the conditions that gave rise to all these grievances, which is, dominate the dominance of finance capital, the, extensive network of rent seekers across the economy who exploit congressional relationships to, secure preferential treatment. And now, of course, the emergence of big tech oligarchs who essentially have the ears of Congress and are able to benefit from both regulatory support, legal support, as well as substantial amounts of government financed contracts. So you've got these three major pillars, and of course, underpinning all of this is the military-industrial complex, which has been the largest beneficiary of the last few years of making America great again, because the idea of manufacturing has dovetailed in with this notion of national security, and lo and behold, the defense budget, so-called, administered by the Secretary of War, is now over $1 trillion. This is unprecedented, and so we've clearly got an institutionalized regime of accumulation, a political economy in the United States that is very much locked in by the powerful interests of finance, big tech, and assorted rent seekers. And what we're seeing is really a reinforcement of that system as opposed to any fundamental challenge to it. Now, the use of cultural wars, in many respects, is a way of distracting people from all of this, and it's not a strategy or a tactic that the alt-right has invented. They actually inherited it, because these are the kinds of tactics that were used by the post-Soviet, or the left, so-called, in the post-Soviet era. After the Soviet Union disbanded, the left was largely left with very little sensible to say around political arrangements and economic affairs, and eventually conceded to the dominant framework of the day in the early 1990s, which was an intensified form of neoliberal experiment. And we saw this across many different jurisdictions to varying degrees. So in the UK, of course, we ended up with Blairite Labour, the so-called third way, in 1997. In the United States, we had Clinton's triangulation, come the 1996 campaign, when Dick Morris, came up with a genius electoral strategy to, in effect, outflank Newt Gingrich and mobilise around ideas such as the reinvention of government and those sorts of things, which were really just euphemisms for the progressive stripping of public institutions and the outsourcing of opportunity and the socialisation of risk. And this took place right across the English-speaking world in particular, but we also found elements of it in other parts of the sort of transatlantic G7 world as well, and in fact into some of the other places such as Australia to different degrees. So so in a sense, the left was stripped of an ability to say anything meaningful about an economy, and so it was left with talking about all these other things. And of course, nobody wanted to talk about questions of class, because every time people talk about questions of class, you're immediately accused of being divisive and talking about the politics of envy and all those sorts of things. And yet, of course, the fundamental question in modern society, as it has always been, is who's got what, and who gets to control whether people eat or not. That seems pretty fundamental to me. And nobody wanted to talk about any of those issues. And so we are left at 2025 with an economic structure in many parts of the sort of developed world that is suffering, or sort of a social structure really that is suffering as a consequence of 40 years of assorted neoliberal experiments. And the only response from the left was meaningless. It really did not speak to the concerns of many ordinary people. It took many of them for granted. And so a political space was left for a rampant alt-right, which was able to step straight into that breach and exploit what was essentially economic grievance by mobilizing cultural grievance instead.
Is it true, because this piggybacks on what we're talking about, Yahoo Finance came out with an article, and they pointed out that 92% of U.S. economic growth for the first half of 2025 came from AI investment.
Yep.
That's astonishing. I mean, because what that means is the predominant, we'd be in a recession right now if it wasn't just for a bunch of money thrown at AI. Or am I getting this wrong?
Yeah, that's right. Look, Associated Reports estimate that GDP growth would have been about 0.6% from memory had it not been for this massive boom in AI capital investment. And, it really tells you how narrow the economic foundations have now become as far as where the sort of wealth is being generated, financial wealth in particular. And it's also very geographically concentrated because data centers that are being built, they're not spread evenly, number one. They're in certain parts of the country. But the point is that there might be some construction jobs whilst they're being built, but they actually don't create much employment, generally speaking, afterwards. What they do, though, is that they affect the structure of the energy network in and around where those centres are. In the short term, they actually lead to increased costs on everyone else because they are, major users of electricity. In the longer term, they may catalyse more investment in the energy structure of these particular areas where they're concentrated, which may lead to a more pronounced sense of the electricity haves and the electricity have-nots, and that will, continue to again compound and exacerbate the spatial and demographic inequalities that have gotten worse in the United States over the last 30 to 40 years. I mean, there are a number of reports that I've read actually from US government departments that have analysed the growing state of geographic inequalities, right? So we're not just talking about inequalities between groups of people, generally speaking. We also see them manifest in very, very clear spatial terms. And of course, when you drive across the United States, it is very obvious that there are large parts of this massive country that is incredibly poor and incredibly detached, in a sense, from those centers of financial wealth. This dynamic of AI, data center, and energy concentration is only making that worse at the moment.
How would we fix that? I mean, you pointed out in your article that China was never a liberal society in the way that we think of liberalism. And so they never really had this need to behave in this way, that they have a more grounded political system in the way that they operate. We're going to build bridges, we're going to build hospitals, railroads, we're going to build, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, it's a country that works towards the betterment of the people who are living in that country. If we can deliver, put money in your pocket, ensure expenses are relatively low, and ensure all of you have jobs and everything else, then that is our definition of success. We don't really look at it in those terms. How
Not
would we
anymore.
fix that in the States? Well,
No, look,
that was only because of the Soviet Union. I mean, we were in a Cold War.
well, that was one example, right, of, in a sense, a post-liberal experiment, which, worked in many respects, but didn't work in others. And so the alt-right reaction is really a post-liberal kind of reaction, but it has a very distinctive Western flavour to it. And so in many regards, it hasn't been able to critique the economic foundations of the liberalism that it actually despises, because it embraces it, in a certain sense. China, of course, never had the problem of having liberalism either economically or socially as part of its fundamental ethos or its fundamental design drivers. There certainly were efforts, particularly by Western missionaries, in the second half of the 1800s, leading into the first quarter of the 20th century, that sought to introduce all sorts of things into China from the West, including a bunch of liberal ideas. And some of those were picked up at the time by intellectuals in the sort of 1920s and 1930s who were looking for answers to the failures of the Qing dynasty, when China was evidently overwhelmed by a more successful and more powerful external force. And And so intellectuals were looking at ways of overcoming China's weakness and were attracted to some extent by the ideas associated with Western liberalism. Now, those ideas in the end didn't take hold on the mainland. And so, we've had a 75-year, Chinese socialist program, which was anchored around public control of finance, particularly public control of the upstream parts of an economic system, and progressive commitments to expanding infrastructure. And importantly, in all of that, a commitment to training people, enabling people to live longer, and transforming the energy foundations of the system at large. So it went from a society or an economic system that barely had any electricity at all to one today which essentially has electricity covering just about every town and every village and every micro village across the entire country, with a significant buffer that enables it to deliver energy in very low cost terms, and which has lots of room for growth industries to literally grow into without distorting the pricing across the system at large. So China's had a very, let's call it a production-oriented view to how it organizes its social and natural resources, whereas the United States, I think, has literally lost that sense of being a productive society and has become one that is far more interested in being a consumption society with little understanding that as productive activities are replaced or are shifted to other parts of the world, that over time the legacy is a hollowing out of the skills and the knowledge and the capabilities of communities to a point where they're actually very, very hard to replace, certainly not things that you can replace with the click of a finger. So what took 40 to 50 years to, in a sense, destroy isn't going to be replaced in 4 to 5 years.
Yeah, what's broken isn't easily fixed. How would we change the political economy? And I don't mean waving a magical wand. I mean, if a person got elected and they said, "Hey, I saw Warwick on Jamal's show. He was fantastic. And I'm going to bring that guy in to get advice on how to fix the ills of this country and the way that this country works in political economy." What do you tell him? Do you tell him to just be like, "Dude, get another job"? What do you whisper in his ear?
No. Look, I'd say the first thing that needs to happen is to find a way of uniting, obviously, an incredibly divided society, because without a sense of cohesion around a constructive program, it's actually quite hard to mobilize resources in a consistent way over many years. Okay, so the response is actually a response that requires consistency, probably over 20 years. That's the first thing. You've got to
that's
build.
hard in our political system.
Correct. One where you've got electoral cycles every 2 years. It's very, very difficult. But the work needs to be put into later conditions that make that more likely to prevail than not. Then you've got to invest in people. Right? I always keep coming back to the fact that all developing societies ultimately rely upon the rising skill levels of its people, the knowledge and the skills that the people can bring to the table. As part of that will be a recommitment to sustaining a healthy community, healthy people. And we've seen since the pandemic actually a decline in life expectancy. I think that decline has flattened now, but nonetheless, this is the first time for a long, long time that life expectancy in the United States has actually gone backwards. Now, that's not a very good sign at all, because if a society struggles to keep its people living longer and healthier, then in a sense it's failing one of the most basic requirements of a society. Right. The other thing we have seen too, in terms of the evidence, is an increase in infant mortality. And that's no good either, because clearly the systems are not succeeding in ensuring that infants being born into the world have a high chance of survival. So that's the second thing I'd be looking at. The third thing I'd be looking at is actually a fundamental root and branch assessment of the energy structure of the system as a whole. Right. And it needs to be done in a non-ideological way. And that's a hard part, because questions of energy have become ideological. They've become, either you're for renewable energies or you're for fossil fuels. And it's partly because it's all been caught up in the broader questions around climate change and human responsibility and all that sort of stuff. But the question I'd be asking is, compared to 10 years ago and 20 years ago, what is the energy return on energy invested status of the United States economy as a whole? And how does that vary across such a massive landmass? Because systems need to actually have a high energy return on energy invested to have available resources for all the other things that societies need to do. So if your energy system fundamentally is actually diminishing in terms of its efficiency, you are actually running out of energetic surpluses to commit to other things. They're actually the first three things that I'd be looking at. And that would then set the pathway for a sensible national development strategy that would, in a sense, take care of the industrial foundations, which of course are energy transformation systems, as well as what I would broadly call the social entropy problems, which is social decay, by ensuring that people have pathways to participate and contribute to this sort of new economy. So you think back to the 1930s with the New Deal. The sense of a New Deal was that it was about the future. It was a new thing. Even in the 1950s, when you had was it Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, right? These were ambitious, forward-looking agendas that really saw the best of the possibilities of the United States. And there's nothing like that at all, and I say this from a long way away looking in, as someone who is concerned, of course, about the state of the United States, because what happens in the United States does affect others in the world, but also on its very own terms. The last thing that I want to see, in a very personal sense, is all of my friends and colleagues in the United States, experience times that, tough times that are actually avoidable. So, so these are the issues I think that the United States, would be well advised to be thinking very hard about collectively as a society. And in that process, I think ultimately realize that the levels of inequality that exist within society are really one of the root causes of the sort of social anxieties that have that we've seen play out tragically, whether it's in opioid addictions, gun violence, and all those sorts of things. So that's the sort of things that I'd be whispering to that particular person.
Is the issue transparency? I in regards to you make the point that somehow the society needs to be able to come back together in order to have a coherent, cohesive strategy moving forward that takes place over the course of several decades. I wonder if this is a difference in the way, let's say, a Chinese perspective, in the way it looks at its political economy, its policies, etc., versus the way the U.S. does. Because, as you point out, 4-year cycles, 2-year cycles for Congress. And, you have vicious divisions between political parties. And in between those vicious divisions, you have people who just don't care. Like 50% of the population just don't vote because they don't see the point. And I can't blame those people, because it's kind of hard to see the point, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do you create a political coalition? And by the way, deserved. Like, I'm not saying this as it's not deserved. It's completely and entirely deserved. Like, as you point out, whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican, both political entities have effectively functioned as an oligarchy in the way that they've organized capital and in the way that they funneled it to the top 1%. Obama enshrined 83% of George Bush's grotesque tax cuts into law. Donald Trump takes it to some, nth scale, as he profits himself off of cryptocurrency and all of these other family businesses that he's effectively involved in. Joe Biden was doing something very similar in regards to his family in Ukraine. So it's like they've monetized the government in a way where they're shuffling money to places that don't necessarily affect everybody else. And so I don't blame the population in the way that the population looks at it. But it's hard, as you point out, to put the pieces back together again after you've effectively done that with this kind of politics of division for decades. It's transparency the issue. I keep thinking to myself that the only way this works if somebody comes out and just is honest, radical honesty. Hey, we have screwed you over royally. This is something that we are going to change. We're going to be open. We're going to be straightforward. We're going to take all the consequences of the vulnerabilities of being transparent. But at the very least, we're being transparent. Is that the pathway to some kind of political revival in this country? Or you think that's too...
Well, look, well, maybe or maybe not, I don't know. But, is transparency a kind of theatre perhaps too? Look, I think part of the challenge is, and I literally mean I don't know. I mean, it's, when you've got such deep divisions, healing those is actually an incredibly difficult thing to do. So I appreciate that many years of compounded divisions isn't healed, in an easy sense. Exactly. Perhaps crises are needed ultimately for something to emerge, which is a rupture from what has gone on for the last 40 to 50 years. And I'm not sure the circumstances are right. I know that prior to me joining the program, you were, talking a little bit about, are the conditions right for something sort of serious or meaningful to happen? Will Americans, or when will, or what will cause Americans who are clearly being hard done by, when will they actually react? Well, they sort of have reacted in their own ways, which is through the politics of cultural grievance. But clearly the policy responses and the policy frameworks being advocated within that broad umbrella are not delivering on the material conditions necessary to transform their lives. Another very interesting example that I often think about is, you hear a lot of talk about, family values, right? And it's a lament about essentially the decline of Fordism, the days of the 1950s and 1960s, which of course were very white. Let's not forget, they were the days when one yes. white bread earning male could go to work, the wife could stay at home, they could buy a house and a car quite, with 10, 12 years of wages, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole lot of lament, a cultural lament about the loss of that. But look at the conditions that made that even possible. Put aside the racial segregation of the labour market, which of course was a key part of the American economy. And let's just look at it on its own terms as well, which is, well, you need a stable wage and rising real wages.
Yes.
You can't financialise housing to a point where it becomes ridiculously unaffordable. Right? So if you're not serious about the structure of wages and the political settlement around wage distribution, then you're not even going to create the conditions that you need to create for, people to have traditional families, right? If that's your sort of social objective. And again, it always comes back, I think, to getting those material conditions right. Look, the other thing is you touched on, which I think is quite an interesting point, and that is that in a voluntary voting system, where in fact the election of particularly the executive branch of the national government is done via a system, a collegial system, right, the Electoral College. The system has long been designed to favour rural and relatively small states. That's right. How it was designed. And it, as a result, means that you have, in a sense, a disproportionate power. A vote from a small state is actually worth more than a vote in a big state. And then on top of that, you've got, relatively poor levels of engagement and turnout. And that ultimately means that a president is actually elected on about 30% of the eligible voters.
Yes.
That's it. That's actually it. Now, that's a systemic thing, right? I'm not sort of saying that that's because, one president's good or bad or whatever, but that's how the system, in a sense, kind of functions. Now, the downside with that system is that it actually means that whatever executive you've got has a very, very thin mandate, because it became the executive with actually about a third of the base of the voting population or the adult population supporting you. It doesn't take much for that base to disappear, or that mandate to basically disappear. So the system, in a sense, doesn't confer a strong mandate to the elected executive, even on its own terms. On its own terms, it's weak. There's also very limited performance reviews, in a sense. The idea of a 2-year cycle for Congress, in a sense, is rendered nonsensical when you look at the number of districts that actually change hands, right? When you look across the entire Congress and also into the Senate, the reality is that maybe a dozen seats or a dozen congressional districts and 2 or 3 states at most, or Senate spots, is ever up for grabs, ever, right? Then you have the gerrymandering, right, on top of that. So you systemically actually have a system that is incredibly non-responsive to voter concerns. We can throw into that the power of financial lobbying and all that sort of stuff, which ultimately drives a whole bunch of congressional priorities. But when you look at this system as it's evolved, it's actually very understandable that it is not responsive, is frequently trapped in gridlock, is incredibly divisive because divisions or difference is amplified every 2 years. The nature of the beast requires the amplification of difference. You don't get elected if people think you're just the same as the other guy. The whole point of the electoral process is to amplify difference, right? To give people a choice, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So the system is designed to be conflictual, divisive, thin mandates, and unresponsive, basically, to the communities at large. Over 250
But that's all Western
years.
systems, right? I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's all Western systems. I mean, if you ever look at PMQs, I loved PMQs. Same thing with Australia PMQs. You guys are brutal.
Yeah, well, electoral campaigns are, right, but the UK system is also a single member geographic electorate first past the post system, which and voluntary voting. So you've again, got modest turnout, and you have what is actually a very large voter dividend. So the executive is not elected, through a college. The executive is actually a consequence of which party has the most seats in the parliament. And the way the system works delivers a very, very large voter dividend. So if you secure 35-40% of the vote across the country, you'll end up with 56% of the electorates of the seats in the parliament. So you end up with these what appears to be these monstrous majorities, right? So Keir Starmer ended up with a monstrous majority, but in fact, it's a very thin mandate. The Australian system is actually a compulsory voting preferential system, right, which delivers essentially the election of the least unpreferred candidate. It's normally one of the 2 major parties, but that's how the system works. And it compels voters, in a sense, to express their preferences. So, and as the counting goes, if you start with 10 candidates on a ballot paper, the counting firstly removes the candidate with the least number of votes and distributes their preferences. Then the next candidate is taken out and their votes are distributed across, and it just works its way up to the point where you've got what they call the 2-party preferred vote, and that delivers also a kind of a winner's bonus as well, but it's nowhere near as pronounced as the winner's bonus in the UK. But the problem in all of these parliamentary systems is that in between elections, there's actually very little capacity for communities to have a real say in many things, because in a sense, anger, anxieties, and disquiet or whatever just gets absorbed into that parliamentary process through committees, etc., etc. So it's not really designed to be particularly participatory, particularly engaged on the ground. It really is designed to concentrate power in the hands of lawmakers and detach them from the day-to-day effects of policies other than through periodic reviews. So, this is fundamentally a limitation of parliamentarism.
Yeah.
It becomes dominated by parties. Parties require money, etc., etc., etc. So, there we have it. But institutionally, I think these are the challenges that the United States faces. These are the cards that it's got. It will require much smarter people than me to figure out how you navigate this set of
Make that
institutional
work.
environments to then find a way to overcoming some of these inherent features in it, which is how do you actually create a more unified program that builds a much broader electoral coalition, right, as opposed to a narrow program that exploits grievance that gets you over the line.
Yeah, it seems like there needs to be some kind of cooperative system, and I don't know what that looks like. I mean, the very act of one person trying to win makes a person behave in a particular way. Yeah, I
Look,
don't
there
know.
may be, I mean, and I have seen discussions around this, from time to time, and these are radical proposals, and I'm not advocating them. I haven't thought much about them. Not being an American, I don't, think some of these proposals. But given that it is, Federation of States, in effect, there is some chatter from time to time about the states actually becoming far more important, but autonomous again, as focal points of economic and social development. And maybe those sorts of debates at least should be aired a lot more about how a more devolved and distributed structure of economic development and social development may perhaps overcome some of the problems that have unfolded over the last 40 years.
Let me actually, just to close, tariffs. So
Yeah.
the Supreme Court is paying attention to the tariff. They're entertaining the arguments that are taking place. Trump is going to lose that. I can't believe he would win that because it is so obviously clear beyond the president's scope to do what Donald Trump has been doing. And so went to appeals court. Appeals court effectively he lost. It's going to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was being very skeptical, or was very skeptical of his powers as an independent president of doing something that is purely within the purview of Congress. And so if he loses that, then what? I mean, he's panicking over this, actually. I mean, he come out and says, hey, I'm going to give $2,000 to Americans. He's not giving any money to Americans. That's not going to happen. But he's saying it because he's trying to, let's say, expand the playing field in regards to the people who think that they are somehow involved in the decision of the court, that this is somehow going to hurt the American population if indeed and when he loses on this particular issue. But what's going to happen materially if the Supreme Court guts his tariff program?
Look, I think the first thing is that he is clearly trying to put a lot of pressure on the court. And
Yes.
From everything that I've read, the oral arguments did not go as well as the president, I'm sure, would have liked them to have gone. And that's despite the fact that the court is dominated by justices that were appointed by the president and previous Republicans. So it's a Republican-leaning court, but nonetheless, there's clearly some concerns that the oral arguments did not go particularly well. Look, and I think you raised some very interesting questions, because if the court does reject or uphold the position of the presidency, it will raise a lot of questions about the court, right, in the eyes of many people and Americans, about its independence, about its ability to function as really the third arm of the division of political power within the American system, or whether in fact it has been entirely compromised. Will it raise bigger questions around reforms to the Supreme Court? It may well do. So there are consequences either way. Should the president lose, of course, at a political level, it will be seen to be something of a slap in the face. But there are many other mechanisms by which he could reinstate assorted forms of tariffs if he wants to continue pursuing that. The other possibility, though I suspect that it's a little bit slight at the moment, is that the president, should he lose, on this question will actually take this as an opportunity to retreat from some bad policies that haven't really worked, but blame the courts for doing it. Right. And in a sense, go into the midterm election year hectoring Congress about it, and blaming Congress for stymieing his program. And that could well be a sort of a political response to it. But nonetheless, I think it will make it very clear that there are certain powers that do not reside without limits with the presidency. The tariffs simply have not delivered the results that they were meant to. Now, most people, I think, lay observers as well as various economists from actually quite a number of different perspectives, do have a consensus view, and that is that the tariffs as implemented were a mess. They, by design, were never going to achieve the objectives of reshoring manufacturing. They were likely to lead to increase in costs, some of which would be absorbed by businesses first and foremost, but eventually they will end up feeding their way into the shopping baskets of ordinary Americans, and we're starting to see that unfold. We have not seen a rejuvenation of manufacturing at all. In fact, for 34 out of the last 36 months, the PMI index for American manufacturing has been in negative territory. It's been contracting. We've seen that in the employment numbers. We're not seeing this sort of dramatic rejuvenation of American industry, despite the promises. And of course, the line comes that you got to give these things time, and all in good time. It's just got to be patient, take time, and it'll all work out. And you hear this all the time, but at some point, people have got to actually just call it. And it hasn't rejuvenated manufacturing. It hasn't led to the reshoring of American industry. It hasn't increased employment or output in manufacturing, and it certainly hasn't led to a reduction in the cost of living. So on all key fronts, it really hasn't been a very successful policy. That's domestic-wise. Globally, the claim is that it's caused a whole bunch of other countries to pay the tariffs because America's been unfairly treated. I mean, that's just patently untrue. So, no doubt the president and his team of spokespeople will continue running that line, but it's just not true. And I think, we can, in that sense, dismiss it as something quite untrue. But what it has done is actually undermine America's reputation globally as an unreliable country, because of all the chopping and changing, as a country that treats allies and non-allies. Well, in fact, sometimes some would argue that it treats allies even worse than non-allies. It really does create a very mixed environment for the United States on a global stage as well. When for decades, one of the things that the United States at least brought to the table was a certain level of consistency in just about everything that you could predict the United States like clockwork. It would have certain things that it would do, and all of those things ensured that the United States was held in reasonable stead, particularly amongst its network of allies. And it's undermined a lot of that. Even here in Australia, there's a whole bunch of doubts emerge now about the United States as to whether or not it's a reliable partner going forward. Is this just a Trump phenomenon, or actually is Trump a symptom of a baked-in structural set of dynamics that is making the United States behave increasingly erratically? This is the consequence of Trump economics at the moment.
Well, contraction. I mean, is the contraction, and my thoughts are fracturing in two different ways. I saw all of the companies that were losing jobs, all of the tech firms that were cutting jobs, like 40,000, 50,000. It depended on the company. Is this because of the emphasis on AI in the States, where the moment that you get some general level of AI, you say, okay, now that we have this thing, how do we get rid of workers and use this thing that we now have? And is the contraction also related just to the increased prices? I mean, The amount people are paying for food, the amount people are paying for healthcare, the amount people are paying for energy, all of these things have effectively gone up. And if you are paying more for these things, you're paying less for other things, which
Yep.
means they're less inclined to buy in the way that they would typically buy as a consumer society, in which case you're going to put pressure on other companies that rely on that buying. I mean, is that what it is? What do you factor the contraction from?
Look, I'm not sure that AI has led yet to a massive wave of
Job
job
losses.
shedding, in large part because companies quite clearly are experimenting still with AI and are struggling to figure out how they can make it work for them. I mean, all
I
of
see.
the reports suggest that has been the case. I don't doubt, of course, that many companies are looking to AI really as a pathway to reducing labor costs, but so far, I'm not sure that the rollout of AI has really led to that yet. But the sort of general tough economic circumstances impacting households is actually dampening the consumer economy. I mean, in fact, the American consumer economy is largely propped up by the top 10% of households, right? So everyone else isn't really consuming in the way that they once did. So there are real pressures in the economic system at large, and the economic system does depend on investment and consumption to, keep the wheels spinning. So I think that these are some of the challenges that are really emerging. I mean, as you get cost pressures coming into, for instance, manufacturing, those cost pressures feed through downstream where, eventually they get passed on to end consumers, and consumers can't buy as much. And eventually more and more jobs are let go downstream. So if you protect upstream activities, the consequence of that is that you'll actually cause the letting go of more workers downstream. So, and this is kind of what the United States is doing, particularly in things like aluminum and steel. It is adversely affecting the downstream industries that use, steel and aluminum. So,
Warwick,
it's an interconnected system. Never forget, the ankle bone's connected to the shin bone, which is connected to the knee bone, as they say. And what you do in one part of the system eventually works its way through the rest of the system, and not always in good ways.
Warwick, fantastic explanation as always. Always appreciate these breakdowns. Always learn something in these breakdowns, and I thank you for it. Warwick Powell, he's adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, chairman, Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies, president of Data Integrity and Supply Chains Association. Warwick, you have a fantastic rest of your night, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure to be with you again, Jamal. You have a great day too.
Thank you. Bye-bye. All right. Warwick is